I started a preaching series at Many Journeys that explores the idea that God created all things and called them good and very good. Another word for good might be beautiful. All things are a divine reflection. Everything, all things, touched by divine creativity. It doesn't need to be beautiful by any earthly measure to be beautiful and good to God. Even a cockroach serves its purpose, wonderfully made. It's our inability to grasp this in ourselves and others that is at the root of so much suffering. We get disconnected from some of what it means to be intimately connected from the very beginning. We begin to be blind to the sacredness that surrounds us. Pray with me. God, thank you for this community. Thank you for another opportunity to gather together and see you in one another. May the words of my mouth and all the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Amen. There was a Christian mystic in the 14th century, Julian of Norwich. She lived during the worst centuries of human history, including the Black Death pandemic that wiped out millions of people, famines, floods, war, corruption. In her writing, she addresses what she believed to be at the root of suffering, the misplaced idea of God's rejection. One has to pause a moment here. She believed the deepest suffering was not in a horrific pandemic, not in famine, not in flood, not being enveloped in a time of war and corruption, but instead God's rejection. Our first reading of the person driving the car down the winding road, quoting scripture. Ever done that? I have, when the road was narrow and more winding with cliffs at the side. There's a song about that one. I think it's called Jesus Takes the Wheel. It's a powerful idea that there's something greater than any current circumstance. We've been hearing a lot more lately about the unfolding mental health crisis in America, but I think it's also a spiritual crisis, a time when this good and beautiful might seem more further and more distant. After all, the messaging of the world is in stark contrast to the message of love, and it's impossible not to hear it. And it threatens every sense of good and very good and etches the ideas of beautiful meant to be, etches into them in bad ways, the things that we're supposed to embrace at every turn. You know, it's Pride Month, so it's been exciting to see every city council, including San Mateo, do something to recognize LGBTQ citizens as part of the fabric of community, that we're seen, our presence is valued. But of course, not everyone is down with the message yet. You might be aware that one of the city council members, Amaranth Lee, had a rock thrown through her window soon after. We feel the violent intent. And the administration has made a direct attack this week on transgender health care. The message: your experience is meaningless and false. You don't know who you are. You are intrinsically evil and a threat. Worse, because we all know the Bible is the weapon of choice against our lives, God hates you. So many LGBTQ people certainly harbor the misplaced idea of God's rejection. And sometimes it carries self-harm and extreme acts of rejecting self. We're in the middle of another wave of marches for racial justice. And a Republican political rally was scheduled for Juneteenth in the place of a massacre of Black bodies. Juneteenth, a day of celebration, the day the last of the slaves found out they were free. This week, the anniversary of Loving versus Virginia. Over and over again, Black members of our community are detained, arrested, even killed for most citizens would get a ticket for. And while the message is clear, even if the date is changed, you are not our equals, you are disordered and perhaps inferior by God's decree. God is not interested in your plight. We could care less about your history and would undo it if we could. I even heard one person in an interview say that it's by design God made some superior. Not all Republicans think this. I'm not saying that. But this is a false teaching. Those of us who hold this idea that in the beginning, every person was somehow not made very good and beautiful. By the way, there's no white people in the Bible. When our leaders decry how much Social Security and Medicare costs, the message we hear is that we're a burden. When Medicaid is demeaned and insurance not available, every person on public assistance begins to be slandered with slurs. It sends a message of expendability. When a crook scams us, it's hard to resist the idea that we are somehow inept and less than, well, wholly beautiful. When some use Bible verses as an excuse not to social justice or wear a mask, they're saying, my inconvenience is too costly, even to save your health. When money and manipulation messages in the press win elections, well, some will wonder whether or not their vote counts at all. Dr. Fairley, who's writing a book that's being published in 2020, writes, Julian, like other contemporaries, acknowledges that there's a great deal of suffering that's simply a part of being human. But what makes this suffering so soul-destroying is that we can't see how beautiful we are, how beloved we are. We no longer remember that we're adored and cherished by God. And if we could reconnect to God's love for us, we would still suffer, but it wouldn't be so overwhelming. For Julian, self and God forgetfulness creates the terrible wound within us and contributes to our destructive behavior while intensifying our anguish. The chant of the past few weeks is probably familiar by now. No justice, no peace, no justice, no peace. In case you haven't noticed, this is true in more than one way. In a spiritual way, it recognized that in order for our spirits to rest, we need to be able to touch that inner peace, that place of good and very good, beautiful, which is the neutral place of wellness, back to the beginning, grasping that God holds us in strength, even as we hold one another. It's that thing you see in some close to death who, in spite of pain, have their laughter, those who find a ready place, those who bring peace to meet the greatest peace of all. It takes a lifetime to train for that. So here's a hint. If we're blind to the sacredness in us, we won't be able to fully see the sacredness, the goodness, and the beauty around us. And if we can see the sacredness and goodness and beauty around us, we will better be able to see the beauty and wellness in us, in spite of circumstance. We might find it community, in one another, and in intentional spiritual practices. There is a love in the air of the universe, goodness, the baseline of all earth and all of us, and we must learn to grasp it. And all this takes practice and intention. And so you're invited this week to work at it. Believe the baseline of all things is beauty and goodness and search for it. Believe that with the rising of every sun, the warmth of God wraps you up again and holds you in whatever circumstance. And today, to complete the sermon, I want to leave you with an image of love that makes us whole. This week, I hope you'll take time to envelop yourself in that love and let it give your very life form.